We begin every episode talking about the age in which the poet lived and wrote. Let me do something different. I'm going to talk about the kind of poetry, what we call black poetry. Afro-American poetry, if you will. We've looked at some other poets earlier. What do? Such poets, the women poets in particular, concentrate on issues of race, color, roots, identity, relationships, motherhood, spirituality, and I think very, very importantly, recuperating. Of course, sexism and racism also. Some of the famous poets, the Afro-American women poets are Anne Petrie, Gloria Naylor, Gwendolyn Brooks, Zora Neale Hurston, Maya Angelou, etc. Yes, some of them were poets, novelists, as well as short story writers. What we need to remember is, till the 20th century, in fact, till the second half of the 20th century, they were almost an absence in English literature. The poem we are looking at now is Women, and the poet, Alice Walker. Born 1944, she comes from a family of sharecroppers. Some of these words are related to a particular area, maybe time and space, of course. She wrote poems, short stories, novels, and a number of talks we have heard from her about life. She won the Pulitzer Prize too. Among her best-known works is The Color Purple, which is an epistolary novel. That means a novel in letters. It's interesting that even black male critics, were very critical of her portrayal of black men. Her memoir is called The Chicken Chronicles. And as I mentioned earlier, her works too deal with those topics and themes which are quite popular and important to the Afro-American writers, especially the women writers. So the poem, interestingly, is called Women by Alice Walker. The poem is called Women, written by a woman poet and brought to you by another woman. Wow, that's a threesome. A short poem. And let me begin by reading the poem. They were women then, my mama's generation, husky of voice, stout of step, with fists as well as hands, how they battered down doors and ironed starched white shirts, how they led armies, head-dragged generals across mimed fields. And so she goes on. Can you see how the poem begins? Talking about women, describing women, and she tells us of her mama's generation, with no feminine qualities, if you please. How were they? They were women, of course, but husky of voice, stout of step. The soft, sweet voice that women should have, the dainty walking around. They didn't have any of that. It's important. How they battered down doors and ironed starched white shirts. Remember, she's probably thinking of women during the period when they were still slaves. They were expected to do all the work that their white masters wanted them to do, and therefore starched white shirts. That's telling us a lot about the kind of work that they had to do. the life that they led. Let me go on. How they led armies, head-ragged generals across mined fields, booby-trapped ditches. And why did they do that? Why did they go across all this pain and torture and difficulty in life? I think then comes the positive idea in the mind of the poet as she looks back at the generation of her mother and other women like her. Why did they do all this? To discover books, desks, a place for us. How they knew what we must know. That generation, my mother and other women like her, were denied any access to education. They were illiterate, frowned upon if any woman wanted to read. But what did they do? They knew how they knew what we must know. And what is that? Without knowing a page of it themselves, they could not read. They were illiterate. They were denied access to education. But that did not stop them from dreaming about education for their daughters. It is because our mothers could dream of a different kind of life for us that we today are living the way that we do. I think, my dear friends, it's very important for us to understand a little bit about the age in which the poet herself lived. You know, sometimes you think a poem is written in a vacuum. Yeah, some kind of poems may be, but there are other kinds of poems which are steeped in a place, which are steeped in time. And I think this is one such poem. The Afro-American women, the way they lived, and the Afro-American women of today who have come a long, long way. I cannot but help myself from reading that again. What did they do? How they knew what we must know. And then the irony of it all, without knowing a page of it themselves. What did they do? They fought for girls' education. And in the poem, we see a reverence in the mind of the poet for these maybe anonymous women, unknown women. She knew her mother, of course, but she's talking of the entire generation. And how were those women? They were not gentle. They were not graceful. Here, I think we have to look at this dual nature of women because they battled. They were women, but they battled. So what is probably considered to be a male trait, they had the ability to overcome obstacles and to face obstacles first so that you can overcome them. When we look at a poem, when we talk about a poem, we talk about different kinds of poetry. What do I mean by that? I'm sure you've heard of the sonnet, the song, the elegy, go ahead, and even the epic. Well, this poem can be called a eulogy. What is a eulogy? You know, a song of praise. And that is what this poem is about. Not written with a regular rhyme or meter, but there are certain figures of speech which you know very well. There is repetition, you know, how they knew what we must know, etc. We have allusions, we have the metaphor, the simile, we have the enjambment, and to me, very, very important is the imagery that the poet is able to create for us. Just shut your eyes for a moment and look at some of the lines of the poem when she talks about stout of step, or fists as well as hands, ironed starched white shirts, armies and mined fields, etc., etc. The imagery is so clear. That is what makes this poem, I think, a much greater poem in addition to the thematic concerns of the poem. When I pick up a poem, no, in fact, when I'm selecting a poem, when I'm looking at poems which are available and which one should I take, I think sometimes I must admit I'm influenced by the writer, Alice Walker. Well, I loved her novel, so why not her poems too? And then I look at other poems that she's written. Nobody's Darling, she calls one poem. What We Thought We Knew is another poem. So, if you like this poem, why don't you read some other poems by the same poet? Or other poems in the same genre? Or poems by other such poets? Well, an entire world is waiting for you there. Read and love them. I think that's what I'm trying to do as I look at each episode of mine.